wooden church of Millbrook stood against the amber sky like a prayer carved from pine and hope. Its weathered boards had witnessed 100 unions, christenings, and farewells, but none quite like the wedding that would unfold this October evening in 1887. The bell tower cast a long shadow across the dusty main street, where horses stamped restlessly at hitching posts and women in their Sunday best gathered like prairie flowers after rain. Clara Whitmore stood before the cracked mirror in the church's small preparation room, her trembling fingers adjusting the ivory lace that crowned her auburn hair. The veil had belonged to her mother, and her mother's mother before that, a delicate thing that had somehow survived the journey west in a covered wagon 20 years prior. Now it framed a face that the townspeople believed belonged to an innocent, sweet-natured girl of 19. They saw her gentle smile, her downcast eyes, the way she helped old Mrs. Henderson with her washing and never missed a Sunday service. They could not see the storm brewing behind those soft brown eyes. "You look beautiful, dear," whispered Sarah Mitchell, the preacher's wife, as she fussed with the pearl buttons running down Clara's spine. "Charles is a fortunate man indeed." Clara's smile never wavered, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. "Thank you, Mrs. Mitchell. I do hope I'll make him happy." The words tasted like ash in her mouth. Through the small window, she could see the guests filing into the church, merchants and farmers, their wives in carefully pressed dresses, children scrubbed clean and fidgeting in uncomfortable shoes. They whispered among themselves with the satisfied air of people witnessing a proper match. The young Whitmore girl, orphaned these past 3 years, finally settling down with a respectable gentleman of means. If only they knew what respectability could hide. Charles Redgrave waited at the altar, his silver-streaked hair combed back with pomade, his black suit pressed to perfection. At 42, he cut an impressive figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of confident bearing that came from success and social standing. He owned the largest general store in Millbrook, had investments in the railroad, and possessed a house on Elm Street that was the envy of every woman in 3 counties. He had also buried 2 wives in the space of 5 years. The first, Margaret, had died of a sudden fever, or so the town doctor had declared. The second, sweet young Emily, had taken a tragic fall down the stairs just 6 months after their wedding. Both deaths had been ruled accidents. Both had left Charles a widower in possession of their modest inheritances. And both had Clara's stomach churning with a knowledge that sat heavy as lead in her chest. She touched the small of her back, feeling the reassuring presence of the thin blade sewn into the lining of her wedding dress. 3 inches of sharp steel, barely thicker than a darning needle but honed to a razor's edge. It had taken her weeks to find a blacksmith in the next county over who would craft such a thing without asking questions, and longer still to learn how to use it properly. The church door opened, and Sheriff Jack Danner stepped inside, removing his hat to reveal hair the color of wheat stubble. His badge caught the lamplight as he nodded to the assembled guests, playing his part perfectly. To everyone else, he was simply doing his duty, keeping the peace at a social gathering. Only Clara knew the truth of why he was really there. Their eyes met for the briefest moment across the crowded room. His weathered face betrayed nothing, but she caught the almost imperceptible nod he gave her. Everything was in place. The organ wheezed to life, played by Miss Eleanor Fitzpatrick, whose arthritis made the wedding march sound more like a funeral dirge. Clara felt Mrs. Mitchell's hands on her shoulders, guiding her toward the door. "It's time, dear." Clara stepped into the main body of the church, and a collective sigh rose from the assembled crowd. She was lovely, they murmured, a vision in white silk and inherited lace, with roses from the parsonage garden clutched in her gloved hands. She walked slowly down the aisle, each step deliberate and measured, her smile never faltering even as her mind raced through the events that had led her to this moment. The discovery had been purely accidental. While helping to clean out the church basement after the spring floods, she had found a water-damaged crate filled with old newspapers from Denver and Colorado Springs. Most were beyond saving, but one page had caught her attention, A small item about the suspicious death of a young woman named Margaret Thornton, who had married a traveling merchant named Charles Redmond just months before her demise. The description of the man had made her blood run cold. More searching in courthouse records, more careful questions posed to traveling merchants and circuit riders, had revealed a pattern that stretched across 3 states and nearly a decade. Charles Redgrave was not his real name, and Millbrook was not his first stop. He was a predator who moved from town to town, courting vulnerable women, marrying them for their assets, and then, when the time was right, eliminating them. She reached the altar, her bouquet steady in her hands despite the tremor that ran through her entire body. Charles smiled down at her with what the congregation surely saw as tender affection, but Clara recognized the look for what it truly was, the satisfied expression of a hunter who had successfully cornered his prey. "Dearly beloved," began Reverend Mitchell, his voice echoing off the wooden walls, "we are gathered here today in the sight of God and this company to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The familiar words washed over Clara as she stood there, her face a mask of bridal serenity while her mind catalogued every detail of the moment. The way Charles's hand felt too warm against hers, the smell of bay rum and something else, something medicinal and slightly sweet that she couldn't quite identify. The sound of Mrs. Patterson's baby fussing in the back pew, quickly shushed by its mother. Sheriff Danner had positioned himself near the side door, she noted with relief. He would follow them to the hotel after the ceremony, keeping his distance but staying close enough to respond when the time came. They had planned this carefully over several clandestine meetings in the past month, each encounter disguised as chance encounters at the general store or casual conversations after church. "Charles Edmund Redgrave," the Reverend continued, "do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death do you part?" "I do," Charles replied, his voice rich and confident. His thumb stroked across Clara's knuckles in what observers would interpret as an affectionate gesture, but she felt the possessive pressure behind it. The way a man might grip a valuable object he had no intention of letting slip away. "And do you, Clara Rose Whitmore, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death do you part?" Clara lifted her eyes to meet Charles's gaze directly for the first time during the ceremony. What she saw there confirmed every suspicion, every carefully gathered piece of evidence. There was triumph in those pale blue eyes, and something else, a cold anticipation that made her skin crawl. "I do," she said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the church. The words were a lie, but they were also a declaration of war. 3 hours before the church bells would summon Millbrook to witness her wedding, Clara Whitmore sat before the cracked mirror in her small room above Henderson's boarding house. The glass bore a spiderweb fracture that ran from the upper left corner to the center, splitting her reflection into fragments. How fitting, she thought, for a woman who was about to shatter into pieces herself. The morning light filtered through thin curtains, casting pale shadows across the sparse furnishings that had been her world these past 3 years. A narrow bed with a patchwork quilt her mother had sewn, a washstand with a chipped porcelain basin, a trunk that held everything she owned in this world, and now, everything she needed to survive the night ahead. She practiced her smile in the broken mirror, tilting her head just so, letting her eyes go soft and dreamy the way Charles expected them to be. The trembling in her hands was real enough. She simply had to make sure he interpreted it as bridal nerves rather than the cold calculation it truly was. "Sweet Clara," she whispered to her reflection, mimicking the tone he used when he thought no one else could hear. Innocent little Clara, who wouldn't hurt a fly. If only he knew how many flies she had caught and dissected as a child, studying their anatomy with the same methodical precision she now applied to studying him. The blade lay across her palm like a silver prayer, 3 inches of tempered steel, barely wider than a hat pin but sharp enough to slice through leather. She had commissioned it from Samuel Kowalski, a Polish blacksmith in Copper Falls, telling him she needed a letter opener for her correspondence. He had crafted it with the same care he put into horseshoes and plow blades, never suspecting it would serve a far deadlier purpose. Clara slipped the weapon into the specially sewn pocket along her spine, just below the point where her corset ended. The dressmaker, Mrs. Abernathy, had clucked about the strange request. Who ever heard of a hidden pocket in a wedding dress? But Clara had insisted, claiming she wanted to carry her mother's prayer book close to her heart during the ceremony. The lie had come so easily it frightened her. She thought of her mother now, dead these 4 years from consumption, and wondered what Martha Whitmore would think of her daughter's wedding day preparations. Would she approve of the deception, the careful planning, the cold-blooded intent to commit violence if necessary? Or would she weep to see what circumstances had forced her gentle daughter to become? Clara pushed the thought away. There was no room for sentiment today. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made her freeze, but they passed by her door without stopping. Mrs. Henderson, most likely, tending to her other boarders. The old woman had been kind enough these past years, keeping Clara's rent low in exchange for help with the cooking and cleaning. She had no idea that her quiet, helpful tenant had spent the last 2 months gathering evidence of multiple murders. Rising from her chair, Clara moved to the window and peered down at Main Street. Already, people were stirring with the anticipation that came before any major social event. She could see Mrs. Patterson hanging wedding decorations from the lampposts, and young Timothy Walsh practicing his role as ring-bearer in front of the barber shop. To them, this was a celebration, the happy ending to a romantic courtship between a respectable businessman and an orphaned girl who deserved some good fortune. They had no idea they were preparing for what might very well be a funeral. Clara turned back to her trunk and withdrew a leather portfolio tied with a faded blue ribbon. Inside were the fruits of her investigation: newspaper clippings, copies of marriage certificates and death records, witness statements she had carefully collected during her travels to neighboring towns. She had even managed to obtain a photograph of Margaret Thornton, Charles's first victim, from a cousin in Denver who had kept it as a memento. The resemblance between Margaret and herself was unmistakable. Both young, both orphaned, both with auburn hair and brown eyes. Emily Jackson, the second wife, had shared similar features. Clara had realized with sickening clarity that Charles had a type: vulnerable young women with small inheritances and no family to ask awkward questions when they died. But Charles had made one crucial mistake in choosing Clara Whitmore. Unlike his previous victims, she was not helpless. Her father had been a Union Army scout before his death, and he had taught his daughter skills that proper ladies were not supposed to possess: how to track and hunt, how to read the signs that meant danger, how to defend herself when cornered. Most importantly, he had taught her that sometimes the only way to stop a predator was to become one yourself. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Clara, dear, it's Sarah Mitchell. May I come in?" Clara quickly secured the portfolio back in her trunk and smoothed her dressing gown. "Of course, Mrs. Mitchell. Please, come in." The preacher's wife entered with her arms full of white silk and lace, the wedding dress that would serve as both costume and armor for the performance ahead. Sarah Mitchell was a good woman, perhaps too good for her own benefit. She believed in the inherent kindness of people, in the power of prayer and community to solve all problems. Clara envied her that faith, even as she prepared to do things that would horrify the gentle woman. "I thought you might need help with the buttons," Sarah said, laying the dress carefully across the bed. "Such intricate work." Mrs. Abernathy truly outdid herself. She did indeed. Clara ran her fingers along the pearl buttons that would conceal the weapon against her spine. "Mrs. Mitchell, may I ask you something?" "Of course." "Dear, do you believe that sometimes good people must do difficult things? Things that might seem wrong to others, but are necessary to protect the innocent?" Sarah paused in her examination of the dress, a small frown creasing her kind face. That's a rather philosophical question for your wedding morning. Clara, why do you ask? Clara forced herself to look uncertain, vulnerable. The mask she had worn for so long it sometimes felt more real than her true face. I suppose I'm just nervous about becoming a wife, about the responsibilities that come with it. Oh, my dear child. Sarah took Clara's hands in hers, squeezing gently. Marriage is a sacred trust, but it's also a partnership. A good husband will cherish and protect you, just as you will support and honor him. Mr. Redgrave seems like a man who understands these duties. If only you knew what duties he truly has in mind, Clara thought. But she simply nodded and allowed Sarah to help her into the wedding dress. Each layer felt like another piece of armor. The chemise, the corset, the bustle, and finally, the elaborate silk gown with its train of imported lace. When Sarah began fastening the buttons up her back, Clara held her breath, praying the woman wouldn't notice the slight bulge where the blade rested. There, Sarah said finally, stepping back to admire her work. You look absolutely radiant, Clara, like an angel. Clara turned to face the cracked mirror one final time, and what she saw there nearly made her laugh with dark irony. She did look angelic, pure and innocent, and trembling with what appeared to be bridal nerves. The perfect image of feminine virtue about to be joined in holy matrimony. No one looking at her would suspect that beneath the white silk and inherited lace beat the heart of someone prepared to kill. Thank you, Mrs. Mitchell, she said softly, for everything. As the preacher's wife bustled about, gathering Clara's simple belongings and chattering about the reception arrangements, Clara made one final check of her preparations. The blade was secure and easily accessible. The portfolio containing all her evidence was hidden but retrievable. Sheriff Danner knew his role and would be watching. Everything was in place for the most important performance of her life, one where the difference between success and failure would quite literally be a matter of life and death. She thought of Margaret Thornton and Emily Jackson, two young women who had stood where she stood now, preparing for what they believed would be the happiest day of their lives. They had trusted in the sanctity of marriage, in the protection of society, in the basic decency of the man they had chosen to love. Clara Whitmore would make no such mistakes. The church bells began to toll, summoning the town to witness a wedding that would be talked about for generations to come, though not for the reasons they expected. The amber light of October sunset streamed through the stained glass windows of Millbrook's First Presbyterian Church, casting jeweled shadows across the wooden pews filled with the town's finest citizens. The air was thick with the scent of prairie roses and beeswax candles, mingling with the faint aroma of dust and old wood that seemed to permeate every building in this corner of the frontier. Clara stood at the altar beside Charles Redgrave, her gloved hand resting lightly in his as Reverend Mitchell spoke the ancient words that would bind them together, at least in the eyes of God and the law. To the assembled congregation, she appeared the picture of bridal perfection, demure, radiant, trembling with what they assumed was the sweet nervousness of an innocent young woman about to become a wife. None of them could see the steel blade pressed against her spine, or the cold calculation behind her downcast eyes. Marriage, Reverend Mitchell intoned, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned through 30 years of frontier ministry, is not to be entered into lightly, but reverently, advisedly, and in the fear of God. It is an institution ordained for the mutual society, help and comfort that one ought to have of the other. Charles squeezed Clara's hand, and she felt the subtle pressure that spoke of possession rather than affection. His thumb traced across her knuckles in what the watching townspeople surely interpreted as tender devotion, but she recognized it for what it truly was, the way a man might stroke a prized horse before putting it through its paces. From her position at the altar, Clara could see the faces of Millbrook's citizens arranged before her like a living tableau. There was Mrs. Patterson in the third pew, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, her baby finally quiet in her arms. Old Mr. Thornberry sat with his hat balanced on his knees, nodding approval at what he saw as a sensible match between a successful businessman and a girl who needed looking after. The Henderson sisters whispered behind their fans, no doubt already planning the gossip they would share at tomorrow's quilting circle. They all believed they were witnessing a love story. In the fourth pew, Sheriff Jack Danner sat with his weathered hands folded, his badge catching the candlelight. To anyone observing, he was simply fulfilling his civic duty, ensuring order at a public gathering. Only Clara knew the true reason for his presence, and the weight of the responsibility that rested on his broad shoulders. His eyes met hers for just a moment, a glance so brief that even Charles, standing beside her, didn't notice. But in that instant, she saw the confirmation she needed. He was ready. Charles Edmund Redgrave, Reverend Mitchell continued, turning his attention to the groom. Wilt thou have this woman to be thy wedded wife, to live together after God's ordinance in the holy estate of matrimony? Wilt thou love her, comfort her, honor and keep her, in sickness and in health, and forsaking all others, keep thee only unto her, so long as ye both shall live? Charles's voice rang out clear and strong, carrying to every corner of the church. I will. The words were beautifully spoken, rich with conviction and warmth. If Clara hadn't known what she knew about this man's true nature, she might have been moved by the sincerity in his tone. He was a masterful performer. She had to give him that. No wonder he had been able to deceive not just his victims, but entire communities. And Clara Rose Whitmore. The Reverend turned to her, his kind eyes twinkling with the satisfaction of a man who believed he was facilitating divine will. Wilt thou have this man to be thy wedded husband, to live together after God's ordinance in the holy estate of matrimony? Wilt thou obey him and serve him, love, honor, and keep him, in sickness and in health, and forsaking all others? Keep thee only unto him, so long as ye both shall live. Clara lifted her eyes to meet Charles's gaze directly, and what she saw there made her stomach clench with revulsion, even as her expression remained sweetly serene. There was triumph in those pale blue eyes, but more than that, there was anticipation. The look of a man who had successfully cornered his prey and was already savoring what would come next. I will, she replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. The lie came easily now. She had been practicing deception for so long that truth and falsehood had begun to blur together in her mind. But these particular words felt different, not just a lie, but a declaration of war disguised as a sacred vow. The ring, Reverend Mitchell announced. And young Timothy Walsh stepped forward with the gold band that Charles had purchased from the jewelry merchant in Denver. The boy's face was scrubbed pink with importance, his hair slicked down with water that was already beginning to rebel against the evening humidity. Charles took the ring with steady fingers and slipped it onto Clara's finger. The gold felt cold against her skin, heavy with implications she had no intention of honoring, but she smiled up at him with what appeared to be radiant joy, playing her part to perfection. With this ring, I thee wed, Charles said, his voice dropping to an intimate register that sent shivers through the assembled ladies. With my body, I thee worship, and with all my worldly goods, I thee endow. The irony of those words was not lost on Clara. His previous wife's worldly goods had indeed been endowed to him, permanently. Once they were no longer alive to object. She wondered if Margaret Thornton and Emily Jackson had felt this same chill when the ring slipped onto their fingers, or if they had been too blinded by what they believed was love to see the trap closing around them. Forasmuch as Charles and Clara have consented together in holy wedlock, Reverend Mitchell proclaimed, raising his voice so that it carried to every corner of the church, and have witnessed the same before God and this company, and thereto have given and pledged their faith, each to the other, and have declared the same by giving and receiving a ring, and by joining hands. I pronounce that they be man and wife together, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. Amen, echoed the congregation, and the sound washed over Clara like a wave. It was done. She was now Mrs. Charles Redgrave, bound to him by law and custom, expected to follow him to whatever fate he had planned for her. But Clara had plans of her own. Charles leaned down to kiss his new bride, and Clara tilted her face up to receive what the assembled crowd expected to see. His lips were warm against hers, but she could taste something beneath the sweetness, something medicinal and slightly bitter that made her think of the mysterious deaths of his previous wives. Even in this moment of supposed joy, he was already beginning his deadly work. The congregation erupted in applause and cheers as the newlyweds turned to face them. Clara smiled and waved, playing the role of the blushing bride while her mind raced through the final details of what would happen next. Charles would escort her to the hotel for their wedding night. The good people of Millbrook would return to their homes, satisfied that they had witnessed a proper courtship reach its natural conclusion. And sometime before dawn, one way or another, the truth about Charles Redgrave would finally come to light. As they walked down the aisle together, Clara caught sight of Sheriff Danner once more. He was already moving toward the side door, positioning himself to follow at a discreet distance. Everything was proceeding according to plan. Outside the church, the townspeople gathered to shower them with rice and well wishes. Mrs. Henderson pressed a basket of food into Clara's hands. "For later, dear, when you work up an appetite." The schoolmarm, Miss Porter, presented them with a hand-embroidered tablecloth. Even cantankerous old Mr. Briggs shook Charles's hand and mumbled something about hoping they'd be blessed with children soon. Children. The thought sent another wave of revulsion through Clara. She wondered how many potential children had died with Margaret and Emily. How many lives Charles had snuffed out in his relentless pursuit of wealth and control. Never again. Not if she could help it. Charles helped her into the carriage that would take them to the Millbrook Hotel, his hand lingering possessively on her waist. As the horse began to move, Clara waved goodbye to the assembled well-wishers, her smile never faltering even as her free hand moved to check the position of the blade hidden in her dress. The sun was setting behind the mountains now, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. Soon it would be dark, and the real wedding night would begin. Clara closed her eyes and said a silent prayer, not for her own safety, but for the strength to do what needed to be done. The carriage wheels rolled steadily toward the hotel, carrying them both toward a reckoning that had been 3 months in the making. The Millbrook Hotel stood 3 stories tall on the corner of Main and Cedar, its red brick facade a testament to the town's growing prosperity. Gas lamps flickered in the windows, casting warm pools of light onto the wooden sidewalk below, while the sound of a piano drifted from the saloon next door. To any observer, it was a perfectly respectable establishment where a newly married couple might spend their first night as husband and wife. Clara's gloved hand rested on Charles's arm as he escorted her through the hotel's modest lobby, past the polished brass spittoons and the oil painting of some long-dead cattle baron that dominated the far wall. The desk clerk, a thin man named Hutchins with nervous eyes and ink-stained fingers, nodded deferentially as they approached. "Evening, Mr. Redgrave, Mrs. Redgrave," he said, stumbling slightly over Clara's new name. "The bridal suite is all prepared, just as you requested. Fresh linens, champagne chilled, and I've had Mary dust everything twice." "Excellent," Charles replied, his voice carrying the easy authority of a man accustomed to having his wishes anticipated. "We're not to be disturbed for any reason. Is that understood?" Something in his tone made the clerk's Adam's apple bob nervously. "Of course, sir. Absolutely no disturbances." As they climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor, Clara felt the weight of the blade against her spine with each step. The hotel's corridors were dimly lit, shadows dancing across the faded wallpaper that had once been fashionable in some distant eastern city. Their footsteps were muffled by a runner that had seen better days, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the muted sounds of other guests. A cough here, the creak of bed springs there. Room 207 bore a small brass nameplate reading Bridal Suite, though Clara suspected the designation was more hopeful than accurate. Charles produced an ornate key from his vest pocket and unlocked the door with a flourish. then stepped aside to allow her to enter first. "After you, my dear wife." The room was larger than Clara had expected, with windows facing the street and a view of the mountains beyond. A four-poster bed dominated the space, its posts carved with roses and draped in white lace that someone, probably the long-suffering Mary, had arranged with obvious care. A small table near the window held a bottle of champagne in a silver bucket, along with 2 crystal glasses that caught the lamplight like captured stars. But it was the other details that made Clara's blood run cold. Heavy curtains that could block out any sound, a door that locked from the inside, and on the bedside table, partially hidden behind a vase of white lilies, a small brown bottle with no label. Charles closed the door behind them with a soft click and turned the key in the lock. The sound seemed to echo in the suddenly airless room. "At last," he said, his voice taking on a different quality now that they were alone. "Just the 2 of us." Clara moved to the window, ostensibly to admire the view, but really to put some distance between them while she gathered her courage. The street below was mostly empty now, the wedding guests having dispersed to their homes and evening routines. A lone figure leaned against the lamppost across the street. Sheriff Danner, she realized with relief, keeping his promised watch. "It's beautiful," she said, allowing a tremor to enter her voice. "The view, I mean, you can see all the way to Miller's Ridge." "Yes," Charles agreed, but he wasn't looking out the window. His gaze was fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Beauty is such a fragile thing, don't you think? Here one moment, gone the next." He moved to the champagne bucket and began working the cork loose with practiced ease. The pop, when it came free, sounded unnaturally loud in the confined space. "A toast," he said, pouring the golden liquid into both glasses. "To new beginnings." Clara accepted the glass he offered, noting how his fingers lingered against hers longer than necessary. The champagne bubbled merrily. Innocent enough, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it had been tampered with. She raised the glass to her lips but didn't drink, instead watching Charles over the rim. He drained his glass in 3 quick swallows, then set it aside with a satisfied sigh. "Drink up, my dear, the night is young, and we have so much to discuss." "Discuss?" Clara lowered her glass without taking more than the smallest sip. "Whatever could we have to discuss on our wedding night?" Charles's smile was sharp as broken glass. "Oh, Clara, sweet, innocent Clara, did you really think I didn't know?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Clara's hand moved instinctively toward her spine, but she forced herself to remain still. "Know what, husband?" "About your little investigation, your trips to neighboring towns, your conversations with that meddlesome sheriff." Charles's facade of gentility was cracking now, revealing something ugly underneath. "Did you think I was blind? That I wouldn't notice my intended bride asking questions about my past?" Clara felt her carefully laid plans beginning to crumble, but she kept her expression innocent, confused. "I don't understand what you mean. I've done nothing but prepare for our wedding." "Liar!" The word cracked like a whip. Charles moved closer, and she could smell the alcohol on his breath, mixed with something else, that same medicinal sweetness she had detected during their kiss at the altar. "I know about the newspaper clippings. I know about your correspondence with Margaret's cousin in Denver. I even know about the photographer you hired to take pictures of Emily's grave." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to appear bewildered rather than afraid. "Charles, you're frightening me. I don't know what—" "Stop." His hand shot out and gripped her wrist, fingers digging into the delicate bones hard enough to leave bruises. "The charade is over. My dear wife, you know exactly what I am, just as I know exactly what you are." "And what am I?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, and Clara immediately regretted giving him the opening. Charles's smile was triumphant now, the expression of a cat that had been toying with a mouse and was finally ready to deliver the killing blow. "You're a clever little thing who thought she could outmaneuver me, who believed she could gather enough evidence to see me hang." He released her wrist and moved to the bedside table, his fingers closing around the unmarked bottle. But you made one crucial mistake. Clara, what mistake was that? You assumed I would wait until after the wedding to begin my work. He held up the bottle so she could see the clear liquid inside. Margaret lasted 3 days after I started dosing her tea. Emily held on for almost a week. Poor thing. But you, my dear, began receiving your medicine a month ago. Clara's blood turned to ice. What are you talking about? The flowers I sent you every Friday. Such beautiful roses, weren't they? And you were so touched by the gesture, so careful to put them in fresh water every day. Charles's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass. Did you know that certain plant extracts can be absorbed through the skin, through the lungs? When you breathe in their scent night after night, the room began to spin slightly, and Clara gripped the windowsill for support. She had thought the occasional dizziness was nerves, the nausea a result of the stress of planning her deception. But if he was telling the truth, "You're lying," she whispered. But even as the words left her lips, she knew he wasn't. Am I? Tell me. Clara, have you been feeling tired lately? A bit weak, perhaps some difficulty concentrating? He unstopped the bottle, and the medicinal smell she had detected earlier filled the room. This will simply accelerate the process. By morning, you'll be another tragic young bride who couldn't handle the excitement of her wedding night. Doctor, Morrison will cite heart failure brought on by nervous exhaustion. Very sad, but these things happen. Clara's mind raced through the implications. If he had been poisoning her for weeks, then she was already compromised. But she wasn't dead yet, which meant there was still time, still a chance to turn the tables on him. Why? She asked, genuinely curious despite her fear. Why do you do this? Surely there are easier ways to acquire wealth. Charles's expression grew thoughtful, almost philosophical. You know, Margaret asked me the same question just before the end. I told her what I'll tell you. It's not really about the money, though that's certainly useful. It's about the power, the absolute control over another human being's fate. He moved closer again, the bottle held casually in one hand. You see, Clara, most men go through life never truly understanding their own capability for dominance. They marry women who eventually grow old and tiresome, who develop opinions and demands and inconvenient ideas about their own worth. But I have discovered something wonderful. The perfect marriage is one that ends before disillusionment can set in. Clara felt the edge of the blade against her spine, sharp and reassuring. She just needed to get close enough. You're insane, she said, backing toward the bed as if in fear. Perhaps, but I'm also very, very good at what I do. Charles followed her, confident now that victory was within his grasp. Don't worry, my dear. It won't hurt much, and it will all be over soon. You'll simply go to sleep and never wake up. Rather peaceful. Really. Clara's hand brushed against the bedpost, and she used it to steady herself while her other hand worked at the hidden opening in her dress. Almost there. One last question, she said, stalling for time. What happens to all the evidence I've gathered? The portfolio hidden in my room? Charles laughed again, the sound making her skin crawl. Oh, that. I'm afraid there was a terrible fire at Henderson's boarding house earlier this evening. Nothing left but ashes. I'm told, such a shame, Mrs. Henderson's arthritis was acting up, and she knocked over an oil lamp. The casual mention of Mrs. Henderson's potential death, for Clara doubted the old woman had escaped such a conveniently timed fire, filled her with a rage so pure it burned away the last traces of fear. This monster had destroyed not just his wives, but anyone who might pose a threat to his carefully constructed facade. You bastard, she whispered, and this time she didn't have to fake the tremor in her voice. Now, language, my dear. Charles raised the bottle toward her lips. Time to drink your medicine like a good girl. Clara's fingers finally closed around the handle of the blade, and her entire demeanor changed in an instant. The trembling stopped. Her spine straightened. And when she looked up at Charles Redgrave, he saw something in her eyes that made him take an involuntary step backward. I don't think so, she said quietly, and the steel in her voice matched the steel now gleaming in her hand. The transformation in Clara was so complete, so sudden, that Charles Redgrave stumbled backward as if he had been struck. The trembling young bride who had stood before him moments earlier was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous, a woman with steel in her spine and ice in her veins, holding a blade that caught the lamplight like a silver flame. "What?" Charles began, but his words died in his throat as Clara stepped forward with the fluid grace of a predator who had finally decided to stop playing with her prey. "Did you really think," she said, her voice carrying a deadly calm that filled the room like winter fog, "that I would come to my own execution unprepared?" The bottle slipped from Charles's suddenly nerveless fingers, shattering against the wooden floor in a spray of glass and poison. The medicinal smell intensified, making the air thick and cloying, but Clara seemed unaffected by it. She moved with purpose now, circling him the way her father had taught her to circle a wounded animal, careful, patient, ready for any sudden movement. "The flowers," Charles said, his voice hoarse with shock and growing fear. "The poison! You should be weak, dying." "I should be many things," Clara agreed, never taking her eyes off his face. "I should be cowering in a corner, begging for mercy. I should be drinking your poison like a good little victim. I should be just another mysterious death for Dr. Morrison to explain away." The blade in her hand never wavered. "But you see, Charles, I learned something very important from my father before he died." "What's that?" The question came out as barely more than a whisper. "Never eat anything a predator offers you." Charles's face went white as the implication sank in. "The flowers, you knew." "I suspected from the very beginning. A man like you doesn't court a woman like me without an ulterior motive." Clara's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Did you think I would simply accept your gifts without question? I've been disposing of your poisoned roses in the creek behind town for weeks now. The fish seemed to enjoy them, right up until they started floating belly up." The revelation hit Charles like a physical blow. His carefully laid plans, months in the making, crumbling around him in the space of a few sentences. But he was not a man who accepted defeat easily. His hand moved toward his jacket pocket, where Clara knew he kept a small pistol. She had observed him enough to learn all his habits. "I wouldn't," she said softly, and something in her tone made him freeze mid-motion. "Your gun is useful for intimidating helpless women, but it's too slow for close quarters. By the time you clear leather, I'll have opened your throat." Charles's eyes darted around the room, seeking escape routes, weapons, anything that might give him an advantage. But Clara had chosen her position well, between him and the door, with the window at her back and nowhere for him to run. "You're bluffing," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You're just a girl. You don't have the stomach for real violence. Is that what you told yourself about Margaret? About Emily?" Clara took another step closer, and Charles was forced to retreat until his back hit the wall. That they were just girls who couldn't fight back? "They were weak," Charles snarled, his mask of civility finally slipping completely. "Pathetic creatures who deserved what they got. But you're different. You think you're clever, but you're still just a woman. Still weak. Still—" The blade flicked out faster than a striking snake, opening a shallow cut across his cheek before he could finish the sentence. Blood began to seep from the wound, dark against his pale skin, and Charles raised a trembling hand to touch it in disbelief. "Weak?" Clara's voice was conversational, almost pleasant. "Perhaps you'd like to reconsider that assessment." Charles's fingers came away from his cheek, stained crimson, and something fundamental shifted in his expression. The predatory confidence was gone, replaced by the dawning realization that he was no longer the hunter in this room. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly on the words. "I want you to tell me about the others." "Others? Don't insult my intelligence. Charles, or should I call you by one of your other names? Charles Redmond from Colorado Springs? Carlton Radcliffe from New Mexico Territory?" Clara circled him again, keeping the blade between them. "How many women have you killed? How many towns have you fled after mysterious accidents claimed your wives?" Charles pressed his back against the wall, his earlier bravado evaporating like morning mist. "I don't know what you're talking about." The blade moved again, this time slicing through the fabric of his jacket and drawing another thin line of blood across his forearm. Charles cried out, more in shock than pain, but the sound was still satisfying to Clara's ears. "Wrong answer," she said calmly. "Let me try again. How many women have you murdered?" "7," he gasped, cradling his wounded arm. "7, including Margaret and Emily, but they were all asking for it. You understand? Getting suspicious, asking questions they had no business asking. Like I did. Yes, exactly like you did. I gave them everything, security, status, a home, and they repaid me with suspicion and ingratitude." Charles's voice rose with self-righteous indignation. "What right did they have to question me? What right did any of you have?" Clara felt a cold fury settle in her chest, but she kept her voice level. "And Mrs. Henderson? Did she ask for it too when you burned down her boarding house?" Charles had the grace to look slightly ashamed, but only slightly. "That was regrettable, but necessary. She might have found your evidence, might have started asking inconvenient questions. These things require a certain thoroughness. She was 70 years old. She took me in when I had nowhere else to go." "Collateral damage," Charles said dismissively. "Sometimes innocent people get hurt. It's unfortunate, but—" He never finished the sentence. Clara's free hand shot out and grabbed him by the throat, pressing him back against the wall with surprising strength. The blade in her other hand hovered inches from his eye, steady as a rock despite the poison that should have been coursing through her system. "Mrs. Henderson was worth 100 of you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying the force of a thunderclap. "She was kind and decent and good, and you killed her to cover your own crimes." Charles made a choking sound, his hands clawing weakly at her grip. For a moment, Clara was tempted to end it right there, to drive the blade home and rid the world of this monster once and for all. It would be so easy, so satisfying, so final. But she needed him alive, at least for now. She released his throat and stepped back, watching as he collapsed to his knees, gasping and coughing. Blood from his wounds had begun to stain his wedding clothes, turning the fine fabric dark and sticky. "Please," he wheezed, looking up at her with eyes that were finally showing the fear she had felt for so many weeks. "Please, I can give you money, property, whatever you want." "What I want," Clara said quietly, "is for you to write it all down, every name, every town, every murder. I want a confession that will clear the innocent and see justice done for the dead." "And if I refuse?" Clara knelt down beside him, bringing the blade close enough to his throat that he could feel the cold metal against his skin. "Then I'll start cutting pieces off you until you change your mind. I may be just a woman, Charles, but I'm also my father's daughter. He taught me how to skin a deer so efficiently that it stays alive and conscious almost until the very end." The color drained from Charles's face as he realized she wasn't bluffing. This wasn't the frightened girl he had thought he was marrying. This was something far more dangerous, a woman who had been pushed beyond her breaking point and was no longer bound by the social conventions that had protected him for so long. "There's paper and ink on the writing desk," Clara said, gesturing toward the corner of the room with her blade. "I suggest you get started. We have a long night ahead of us, and I want every detail perfect before the sun comes up." Charles struggled to his feet, moving slowly and carefully under Clara's watchful gaze. His hands shook as he picked up the pen, and droplets of blood from his wounds spotted the clean white paper. "Start with Margaret," Clara instructed, settling into a chair where she could watch both him and the door. "Her full name, where and when you met her, how you killed her. Leave nothing out." As Charles began to write, his hand trembling with each word, Clara allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. The trap had been sprung, but not the way anyone had expected. The hunter had become the hunted, and justice, long delayed, was finally beginning to take shape in the lamplight of a hotel room that had been meant to be her tomb. Outside. She could hear the distant sound of the church bell tolling midnight. Her wedding day was over, but her work was just beginning. The pale light of dawn crept through the lace curtains of the hotel room like a hesitant witness, casting long shadows across a scene that would have shocked the good people of Millbrook to their very souls. Clara sat by the window in her blood-stained wedding dress, the ivory silk now marked with dark stains that told their own story. Her auburn hair had come loose from its careful arrangement, falling in waves around her shoulders. But her brown eyes remained alert and watchful. Across the room, Charles Redgrave hunched over the writing desk like a broken man. His once proud shoulders curved in defeat. The fine wedding suit that had made him look so distinguished at the altar was torn and bloodied, testament to the struggle that had taken place in the early hours of what should have been their honeymoon. His right hand moved slowly across the paper, each word extracted like a confession pulled from his very soul. The pile of completed pages beside him had grown steadily through the night. 7 women's names, 7 towns, 7 carefully orchestrated murders spanning nearly a decade of systematic predation. Margaret Thornton of Colorado Springs, who had discovered discrepancies in his business accounts. Emily Jackson of Silver Creek, who had found love letters from his previous wife. Susan Crawford of Pueblo, whose inheritance had been larger than expected, making her death more profitable than her continued existence. Each confession was detailed, methodical, written in Charles's own hand with his signature beneath, evidence that would hold up in any court of law, assuming he lived long enough to face trial. Clara's fingers traced the handle of the blade that rested across her lap, its steel surface now cleaned of blood, but still sharp enough to end this nightmare with a single decisive motion. She had been tempted more than once during the long hours of darkness, when Charles had tried to bargain for his freedom by offering to split his ill-gotten wealth with her, when he had attempted to justify his crimes by claiming his victims had somehow deserved their fate, when he had broken down and wept, not from remorse for the lives he had taken, but from self-pity at being caught. Each time, she had resisted the urge to simply end it. Not out of mercy. Charles Redgrave deserved no mercy, but because the dead women's families deserved justice, not vengeance. They deserved to know the truth about what had happened to their daughters, their sisters, their friends. A soft knock at the door broke the morning silence. Clara tensed, her grip tightening on the blade. But the pattern was the one she had been waiting for. 3 quick raps, followed by 2 longer ones. "It's Sheriff Danner," came the familiar voice from the hallway. "Are you all right in there, Mrs. Redgrave?" The name felt like poison on her tongue, but Clara knew she would have to bear it a little while longer. "We're fine. Sheriff, just give me one more moment." She moved to stand behind Charles, reading over his shoulder as he finished the final confession, his own crimes here in Millbrook, including the deliberate fire that had claimed Mrs. Henderson's life and destroyed the evidence Clara had so carefully gathered. "Sign it," she commanded quietly. Charles's hand shook as he wrote his name at the bottom of the page, sealing his own fate with ink and admission. When he was finished, Clara gathered all the papers together and tucked them into the bodice of her dress, the most secure place she could think of. "Now what?" Charles asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The fight had gone out of him completely, leaving behind only a hollow shell of the confident predator who had walked into this room the night before. "Now you face justice," Clara replied. She moved to the door and turned the key, admitting Sheriff Danner into a scene that told its own story. Jack Danner was a man who had seen his share of violence in 30 years of frontier law enforcement, but even he paused in the doorway when he took in the full scope of what had transpired. Clara stood there in her ruined wedding dress like some avenging angel, while Charles cowered beside the writing desk like a whipped dog. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," the sheriff breathed, removing his hat as he surveyed the room. "Clara, are you hurt? Do you need the doctor?" "I'm unharmed," she replied, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. The poison Charles had been feeding her through the flowers had taken its toll. She could feel the weakness in her limbs, the occasional dizziness that threatened to overwhelm her. But she was alive, which was more than could be said for his previous victims. And him? Danner nodded toward Charles, who sat slumped in his chair like a man awaiting execution. Alive, as you can see. He's been very cooperative. Clara's smile held no warmth whatsoever. He's written out full confessions to 7 murders, including detailed descriptions of his methods and the locations where he committed his crimes. Sheriff Danner's weathered face hardened as the implications sank in. 7 murders, 7 young women who had trusted this man, married him, and paid for that trust with their lives. Sweet Mother of God. There's more. Clara continued, her voice steady despite the exhaustion that was beginning to claim her. He admitted to setting the fire at Henderson's boarding house to destroy evidence. Mrs. Henderson died because of him. At this, something dark and terrible passed across the sheriff's features. Martha Henderson had been a pillar of the community, a kind woman who had never harmed a soul in her 70 years. Her death had shaken the entire town, but they had all accepted it as a tragic accident. "Is this true?" Danner asked, directing the question to Charles. Charles raised his head slowly, his pale eyes meeting the sheriff's gaze with what might have been the first honest expression he had worn in years. "Yes," he whispered. "It's all true, every word." "Why?" The question came out like a growl, and Clara could see the sheriff's hand moving instinctively toward his gun. "Why did you do it? What kind of monster are you?" "The kind that gets away with it," Charles replied with a bitter laugh. "Or at least, the kind that did until now." He gestured weakly toward Clara. "She's not like the others. She's stronger, smarter. I underestimated her." "That was your mistake," Clara said quietly. "You assumed that because I was young and alone. I would be helpless, but my father taught me that the most dangerous predators are the ones that look harmless." Sheriff Danner pulled out a pair of iron shackles and moved toward Charles. "Charles Redgrave, you're under arrest for the murders of Margaret Thornton, Emily Jackson, and 5 other women whose names I'll be reading from your confessions. You're also charged with the murder of Martha Henderson and arson in the destruction of her property." As the shackles clicked into place around Charles's wrists, he looked up at Clara with something that might have been respect, if such a thing were possible from a man like him. "You know," he said conversationally, "you would have made a formidable partner if circumstances had been different. Such attention to detail, such careful planning. It's almost a shame to see such talent wasted on righteousness." Clara's expression didn't change, but her grip on the blade tightened slightly. "The only shame here is that 7 women had to die before someone stopped you." Sheriff Danner hauled Charles to his feet with more force than was strictly necessary. "Save your breath for the judge, you bastard. You're going to need all the talking you can do to convince 12 men not to string you up from the nearest tree." As they prepared to leave the room, Clara caught sight of herself in the mirror across from the bed. The woman staring back at her was a stranger, hair wild, dress stained with blood, eyes holding depths of knowledge that no 19-year-old should possess. She was no longer the innocent girl who had walked down the church aisle the evening before. That Clara Whitmore had died somewhere in the dark hours of the night, replaced by someone harder, colder, but infinitely stronger. "Clara," Sheriff Danner said gently, "what do you want me to tell people? About what happened here? I mean," she considered the question carefully. "The truth would scandalize the town, challenge their assumptions about proper feminine behavior, and probably make her life considerably more difficult. But it would also serve as a warning to other predators who might think that frontier women were easy prey." "Tell them the truth," she said finally. "All of it. Let them know that Charles Redgrave was a killer who preyed on vulnerable women, and that his hunting days are over. And if they ask how you knew, how you prepared for this?" Clara moved to the window and looked down at the street below, where early morning light was beginning to reveal the normal rhythms of a small town waking up. Soon, the news would spread like wildfire through every home and business in Millbrook. The young bride who had seemed so sweet and helpless had turned the tables on a serial killer. It would be the talk of the territory for years to come. "Tell them," she said quietly, "that sometimes the best way to catch a predator is to become better at hunting than they are." Sheriff Danner nodded grimly and began escorting Charles toward the door. But before they could leave, Charles turned back one final time. "The poison," he said, his voice carrying an odd note of concern. "You've been exposed to it for weeks. You should see a doctor. Make sure there are no lasting effects." Clara studied his face, searching for any sign of deception, but found only what appeared to be genuine worry. Even now, facing the gallows, some small part of him seemed to regret what he had tried to do to her. "Why do you care?" she asked. Charles was quiet for a long moment, his shackled hands hanging at his sides. "Because," he said finally, "you're the first person who ever beat me at my own game. That deserves a certain professional respect." Clara said nothing as Sheriff Danner led him away, but she filed the warning about the poison away for future consideration. Charles Redgrave might be a monster, but he was also a careful, methodical killer who understood the tools of his trade better than anyone. If he said she needed medical attention, she probably did. By noon, the news had spread through Millbrook like wildfire through dry prairie grass, in the general store, at the post office, outside the church, and in every parlor where ladies gathered for their weekly social calls. The same impossible story was being told and retold, each iteration adding new details and layers of astonishment. Charles Redgrave, the distinguished businessman, the eligible widower, the man they had all respected and envied, was a cold-blooded killer. And Clara Whitmore, sweet, innocent Clara, who helped with the church socials and never spoke above a whisper, had not only exposed him but fought him off with a blade hidden in her wedding dress. "I don't believe a word of it," declared Mrs. Cornelia Ashworth, the banker's wife, as she fanned herself vigorously in the oppressive heat of Millbrook's October afternoon. She sat in the parlor of the town's most prominent citizen, Judge Ezekiel Morrison, surrounded by the other leading ladies of the community who had gathered for an emergency meeting of the Women's Auxiliary Society, though auxiliary to what, none of them could say anymore. "Believe what you like, Cornelia," replied Mrs. Sarah Mitchell, the preacher's wife, her usually gentle voice carrying an edge that surprised everyone present. "I saw the blood on her dress with my own eyes when Sheriff Danner brought her to the church this morning. I saw the confessions written in Charles's own hand." The confessions had been the final nail in the coffin of disbelief. 7 pages of meticulous detail, each murder described with clinical precision, each victim named and mourned. Sheriff Danner had read selected portions aloud to the hastily assembled town council, his weathered voice breaking more than once as he recounted the systematic destruction of innocent lives. "But Clara Whitmore," protested Mrs. Elizabeth Patterson, bouncing her fussing baby on her knee. "That slip of a girl, standing up to a man like Charles? It's simply not possible. She can barely lift a wash basin, let alone fight off a grown man." "Perhaps we don't know Clara as well as we thought," suggested Miss Eleanor Porter, the schoolmarm, whose sharp eyes had always seen more than most people realized. "I've taught enough children to recognize the difference between genuine timidity and careful observation. That girl has been watching and learning for longer than any of us suspected." Outside the judge's house, the men of Millbrook had gathered in their own informal council, clustering around the steps of the courthouse where Sheriff Danner was preparing to transport Charles to the territorial capital for trial. The mood was uglier here, more volatile, fed by shame and anger and the peculiar masculine humiliation that came from being deceived by someone they had trusted. "We should string him up right here," growled Benjamin Thornberry, the oldest merchant in town, his gnarled hands gripping his walking stick like a weapon. "Save the territory, the expense of a trial, and the rope the wear. Now, Ben," cautioned Dr. Theodore Morrison, though his own face was gray with shock at the revelations. "We're civilized men. We follow the law, even when it's difficult." "Civilized?" Benjamin spat into the dust. Was it civilized when he burned down Martha Henderson's boarding house? When he poisoned that poor girl night after night? When he stood in our church and made a mockery of holy matrimony? The crowd murmured its agreement, and Sheriff Danner felt the familiar tension that preceded mob justice. He had seen it before, in other towns, with other criminals. The way reasonable men could transform into something primal and dangerous when their trust was violated. "Listen to me, all of you," he said, raising his voice to carry over the angry muttering. "Charles Redgrave will face justice, legal justice, in a court of law, with a proper judge and jury. That's what separates us from the animals." "What about Clara?" called out a voice from the back of the crowd. "What's to become of her now?" It was a question that had been weighing heavily on everyone's minds. By law, Clara was still Charles's wife. The marriage had been legally performed, properly witnessed, and consummated in the eyes of the church. But what did that mean when the groom was a confessed serial killer who had intended to murder his bride before morning? "The marriage will be annulled," Judge Morrison announced, emerging from his house where his wife's auxiliary society was still in heated debate. "I'll see to the paperwork myself. No woman should be bound to a man who tried to kill her, regardless of what the law books say." Inside the jailhouse, Charles Redgrave sat in the single cell that served as Millbrook's accommodation for serious criminals. He had been cleaned up, his wounds dressed by Dr. Morrison's reluctant hands, and fed a simple meal of bread and water. But the confident predator who had stalked the streets of this town for months was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed man who seemed to have aged a decade overnight. The sound of raised voices from the street drifted through the barred window, and Charles could hear his name being spoken with the kind of venom usually reserved for rabid dogs. He had miscalculated badly, not just with Clara, but with the entire situation. He had assumed that frontier communities were too concerned with their own survival to ask uncomfortable questions about the occasional tragic death. He had been wrong. "They want to lynch you," Sheriff Danner observed, settling into the chair across from the cell with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. "Can't say I blame them." "Will you let them?" Charles asked, his voice carrying only mild curiosity. "No, you'll live long enough to hang legally, assuming the judge and jury see fit to sentence you to death." Danner studied the man he had been watching for weeks, looking for some sign of remorse or humanity. "Do you regret any of it? The women you killed? The lives you destroyed?" Charles considered the question seriously, staring up at the water-stained ceiling of his cell. "I regret being caught," he said finally. "I regret underestimating Clara Whitmore. But the rest of it?" He shrugged. "They were weak. I was strong. Nature has its own justice." Sheriff Danner felt his hand move toward his gun, but he forced himself to remain still. The law would deal with Charles Redgrave. It had to. 3 blocks away, in the modest room above what had once been Henderson's boarding house, but was now a pile of charred timber and ash. Clara sat on the edge of the bed that Dr. Morrison had arranged for her at the hotel. The physician had examined her thoroughly, testing her reflexes, checking her pupils, and taking multiple samples of her blood to send to Denver for analysis. "The poison is still in your system," he had told her grimly. "Whatever he was giving you, it's designed to accumulate slowly and cause gradual organ failure. You're lucky you stopped taking it when you did." Lucky. Clara almost laughed at the word. She didn't feel lucky. She felt hollowed out, changed in ways that went far deeper than any physical poison. The events of the past 24 hours had stripped away every illusion she had ever held about safety, about community, about the fundamental decency of human nature. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Clara, it's Sarah Mitchell. May I come in?" Clara considered refusing. She wasn't ready to face the questions, the judgment, the inevitable attempts to understand how sweet little Clara Whitmore had become someone capable of holding a man at knife point all night. But Mrs. Mitchell had been kind to her, and kindness was in short supply at the moment. "Please, come in." Sarah Mitchell entered carrying a carpet bag and wearing an expression of maternal concern that almost broke Clara's carefully maintained composure. "I've brought you some clothes," she said gently. "I thought you might want to get out of that dress." Clara looked down at the blood-stained wedding gown that she was still wearing. 12 hours after the events in the hotel room, the ivory silk was ruined beyond repair, marked with the evidence of violence and survival. But somehow, she couldn't bring herself to take it off, as if removing it would mean accepting that the nightmare was really over. "The whole town is talking," Sarah continued, settling into the room's single chair. "They don't know what to make of you anymore. Clara, some are calling you a hero. Others are frightened of what you might do next." "And what do you think?" Clara asked. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying the young woman who sat before her like a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. "I think," she said finally, "that you did what you had to do. I think you saved not just your own life, but the lives of however many women Charles would have killed in the future. And I think the world is a better place with him in jail and you alive. But I also think you're going to have a difficult time in this town from now on. People don't like to be reminded that their safe little world can be shattered so easily. They're going to look at you and remember that they were fooled, that they celebrated a monster's wedding and welcomed him into their homes." Clara nodded slowly. She had already begun to understand this truth in the look she had received that morning, the mixture of awe, fear, and resentment, in the eyes of people who had known her all her life, but suddenly weren't sure who she really was. "What will you do?" Sarah asked gently. Clara moved to the window and looked out at the town where she had lived for 3 years, the place she had thought of as home. But home was built on foundations of trust and acceptance, and those foundations had been shattered as surely as Charles's carefully constructed facade. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I know I can't stay here, not anymore." The trial, when it came 2 weeks later, was a sensation that drew visitors from 3 territories. Charles Redgrave was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to hang by the neck until dead. He showed no emotion when the verdict was read, no remorse when given the opportunity to make a final statement. But that was still in the future, for now. Clara sat in her hotel room, wearing a blood-stained wedding dress and contemplating a world that had changed irrevocably in the space of a single night. Outside her window, the good people of Millbrook went about their daily business, but nothing would ever be quite the same again. The monster was in jail, but the woman who had caged him remained, and no one, least of all Clara herself, was entirely sure what that meant for any of them. 6 months after the trial that had captivated 3 territories and seen Charles Redgrave swing from the gallows in Denver, Clara stood before a different mirror in a different room, studying a reflection that bore little resemblance to the trembling bride who had once practiced smiles in a cracked glass. The woman looking back at her had steel in her spine and purpose in her eyes, someone who had walked through fire and emerged transformed. The house on Elm Street had become hers by right of inheritance, a bitter irony that Charles himself had probably never anticipated. Under territorial law, his estate had passed to his legal widow, and despite the annulment proceedings, Clara had been his wife at the time of his crimes. Judge Morrison had ruled that the blood money should serve a better purpose than enriching the territory's coffers. But Clara had not kept the grand house with its fine furnishings and dark memories. Instead, she had sold most of Charles's possessions and used the proceeds for something the town of Millbrook had never seen before: a refuge. The Henderson House, as it had come to be known, stood where Martha Henderson's boarding house had once welcomed travelers and the displaced. Clara had rebuilt it from the ground up, but this time with a different purpose. The sign by the front gate read simply, "Safe Haven for Women in Need." But everyone in 3 counties understood what that meant. It was a place where women could come when their husbands' fists spoke louder than their words, where young girls who had been cast out by their families could find shelter and support, where widows with nowhere to turn could rebuild their lives with dignity intact, and most importantly, where any woman could learn to defend herself against those who would do her harm. "Miss Clara," came a tentative voice from the doorway. "The new ladies have arrived." Clara turned from the mirror to see Rebecca Hartwell, a young woman who had come to the Henderson house 3 months prior with a blackened eye and a broken arm, courtesy of a husband who believed his wedding vows gave him the right to use his wife as a punching bag. Now Rebecca served as Clara's assistant, helping to coordinate the house's activities and welcome new arrivals. "Thank you, Rebecca. I'll be down in a moment." Clara took one final look at her reflection. adjusting the simple blue dress that had replaced the elaborate gowns Charles had insisted she wear during their courtship. She had learned to prefer practical clothing, garments that allowed for free movement and concealed the small knife she still carried as a matter of course. The frontier was no more civilized now than it had been 6 months ago, and Clara Whitmore was no longer a woman who believed in taking chances with her safety. Downstairs, the main parlor of the Henderson house buzzed with quiet activity. 3 new arrivals sat uncertainly on the horsehair sofa, clutching carpet bags and wearing the particular combination of hope and fear that Clara had learned to recognize in women who had reached the end of their endurance. The oldest of the 3 was perhaps 30, with graying hair and hands that bore the calluses of hard work. The youngest couldn't have been more than 16, her belly rounded with the promise of a child whose father had clearly abandoned his responsibilities. Between them sat a woman of Clara's own age, her face bearing the telltale marks of recent violence despite her obvious attempts to hide them with powder and careful positioning. "Ladies," Clara said, settling into the chair that faced the sofa. "Welcome to the Henderson house. I'm Clara Whitmore, and I want you to know that you're safe here." The words came easily now, worn smooth by months of repetition, but they carried the weight of absolute truth. Clara had made certain of that. The house employed 3 men whose job it was to ensure that no angry husband or vengeful father could breach the sanctuary she had created. They were all former soldiers, men who understood the value of protecting the innocent and had no qualms about turning away unwelcome visitors with whatever force proved necessary. "We don't have much money," the oldest woman said hesitantly, "but we can work, all of us. We don't expect charity." "This isn't charity," Clara replied gently. "This is one woman helping another, the way women have always done when men fail to be what they should be. You'll work, yes, but you'll also learn how to read and write, if you don't already know, how to manage money and property, how to defend yourselves if the need arises." The last point always raised eyebrows, but Clara had learned that it was perhaps the most important service the Henderson house provided. In the back parlor, converted from what had once been Charles's study, she conducted lessons that would have scandalized proper society. Women learned to handle knives and guns, to recognize the signs of dangerous men, to strike back when cornered. Word of these activities had spread throughout the territory, bringing both supporters and critics in equal measure. Some praised Clara for her innovative approach to helping women in distress. Others whispered that she was corrupting feminine virtue and encouraging wives to rebel against their rightful masters. Clara had learned to ignore both the praise and the criticism. The only opinions that mattered to her were those of the women she helped, and the statistics that showed fewer mysterious deaths among young wives in the counties surrounding Millbrook. "There's someone here to see you," Rebecca announced from the doorway. "Sheriff Danner is waiting in your office." Clara excused herself from the new arrivals and made her way to the small room at the back of the house that served as her private office. Jack Danner stood with his hat in his hands, his weathered face bearing an expression of concern that immediately put her on alert. "What's wrong?" she asked without preamble. They had moved beyond social pleasantries months ago, when their partnership had evolved from sheriff and witness to something approaching genuine friendship. "Another one," he said grimly, producing a telegram from his vest pocket. "Town called Silver Ridge, about 2 days' ride south. Young woman married a traveling merchant 6 months ago. Found dead in her bed yesterday morning under circumstances that sound mighty familiar." Clara felt the familiar chill that came with news of predators at work. In the months since Charles's execution, she and Sheriff Danner had developed an informal network of lawmen throughout the territory, sharing information about suspicious deaths and dangerous men. The results had been sobering. Charles Redgrave had been far from unique in his methods or his appetites. "What do we know about the husband?" she asked, already reaching for her traveling coat. "Calls himself Robert Sinclair. Showed up in Silver Ridge about 8 months ago with money to invest and a sad story about losing his first wife to influenza. Courted the local banker's daughter, married her quick, and now she's dead while he's making arrangements to sell her property and move on." Clara nodded grimly. The pattern was depressingly familiar, a variation on the same theme that had brought Charles to Millbrook and would likely bring other predators to other unsuspecting towns until someone stopped them. "How long before he disappears?" she asked. "Sheriff in Silver Ridge thinks maybe a week, 2 at the outside. He's smart enough to look grieved and stick around for the funeral, but not smart enough to realize his story has holes you could drive a wagon through." Clara was already moving toward the door, her mind racing through the logistics of what would need to be done. "I'll need to send word to the house. Let Rebecca know she's in charge while I'm gone, and I'll need my traveling bag." "The one with Clara." Sheriff Danner's voice stopped her mid-sentence. "This isn't your responsibility. We can handle this through official channels. Gather evidence the proper way." She turned to face him, and he saw in her eyes the same steel that had cowed Charles Redgrave in a hotel room 6 months earlier. How many official channels were available to Margaret Thornton, to Emily Jackson, to all the women whose names we'll never know because no one cared enough to connect the patterns? That's different. You were in danger then. This time another woman is in danger, and I have the knowledge and resources to help her. Clara's voice carried the quiet authority that came from having faced down a killer and lived to tell about it. "I'm not asking for your permission, Jack. I'm asking for your help." Sheriff Danner studied her face for a long moment, recognizing the futility of trying to dissuade her. Clara Whitmore had become something unprecedented in his experience, a woman who refused to accept that evil was simply the natural order of things, who had dedicated her life to evening the odds for those who couldn't protect themselves. "What do you need?" he asked finally. 2 hours later, Clara sat in the stagecoach bound for Silver Ridge, her traveling bag secured beside her and her mind focused on the task ahead. She carried with her not just weapons and tools, but something more valuable, the hard-won knowledge of how predators operated and the absolute certainty that they could be stopped. Behind her, the Henderson house continued its quiet work of transformation, sheltering women who had nowhere else to turn and teaching them that they were stronger than they knew. It was a legacy that Charles Redgrave could never have imagined when he chose his victims, that his crimes would give birth to something that would make it harder for men like him to succeed. As the stagecoach rolled through the mountain passes toward Silver Ridge and whatever waited there, Clara allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. She was no longer the frightened girl who had practiced expressions in a cracked mirror, no longer the victim who had waited passively for rescue. She had become something new, something dangerous to those who preyed on the innocent, something hopeful to those who needed protection. She had become exactly what the frontier needed, even if it didn't always appreciate the gift. The woman in the stagecoach window bore little resemblance to the bride who had walked down the aisle 6 months earlier. But then again, that bride had been playing a role, hiding her true nature beneath layers of expected femininity. This woman, scarred but not broken, hardened but not bitter. This was who Clara Whitmore truly was. And she was just getting started. Retry Claude can make mistakes? Please double-check responses. Research Sonnet 4.